Hi there, my name's Simon Sweetman, and I'm a freelance music writer and a poet. And this is my first book of poetry. It's called The Death of Music Journalism, out by Cuba Press. It's my second book. I wrote a book called On Song about 8 years ago that was music journalism. There's a lot of music journalism in The Death of Music Journalism, or a lot of music ideas. There's a QR code on the back cover that you can scan and get taken to a Spotify playlist. There are 79 songs mentioned somewhere, somehow, or implied, referred to in this book, or the poems are influenced by. And so I made that all into a playlist that you can check out. We are launching the book in Wellington, at a venue called Meow, on Sunday the 11th of October at 4 p.m. I've got Freya Daly Sadgrove reading some poems, and Rachel McAlpine reading some poems, and some live music. And I guess I'll be reading some poems, and Pip Adam is launching the book. So I'm blown away by all of that, and of course by Cuba Press wanting to put this book out. I'm going to read you some poems, and I hope you like them. But you can say what you want about the poems; they can't hear you. So we'll just crack into it with a poem I wrote called "The Fucking Problem." Anita O'Day didn't know she was being filmed for jazz on a summer's day. Have you seen that fucking film? It's everything, and then right in the middle of everything, Anita O'Day saunters to the stage. She has this hat and gloves, the dress, and so much sass, and she sings one of the greatest versions of one of the greatest songs, Sweet Georgia Brown. And she's on the junk and unaware of the cameras, and it goes down in history. It goes down as history. She was just trying to make it through the set. And yet I'm supposed to say that some flavour of whatever month is good, just because they have a lot of likes on Facebook, followers on Twitter, and some towering and unrealistic version of the latest kind of self-belief. This is the fucking problem. All you can do is learn to be a good loser. You know who said that? You can guess, I'm sure, because the end of the poem is nearly here. Anita O'Day said that. Everything she said counted, whether it was for the record or not. This first section of the book I've called starts off well. A lot of name dropping though, and I don't hear a single. So there's a lot of poems in here that mention musicians, music. Like there's a lot of things that artists I've reviewed, or ideas I have around music that I wanted to. So there's a lot of that in the first section. I've got a theory about the Beatles, and I guess I've got a few, but I've got one that so far that I've put down in paper, and it's a poem in this book. It's called Beatles Theory, so I'm going to read that to you now. A lot of people seem to think that Paul McCartney and John Lennon hated each other, were competitive, and that Yoko was a pesky nuisance as well. The Yoko thing, that's mostly racism and sexism too. Paul and John are on the record as having had a bit of hang time through the 70s, a spectacularly awful drunken jam, a night where they watched SNL together, thought about going to the studio to claim the joke check, $3,000 or whatever it was, that Lorne Michaels held aloft, but just got high instead. John and Paul would fire some barbs at one another, or get the press to do it on their behalf. But they also visited and talked and thought often about recording together again. John heard McCartney too, or at least heard Coming Up. He pulled to the side of the road, loved it, said something like, "Paul's back." John would be back too, soon. He'd be starting over. The sadness, of course, was that was number one with a bullet. But the real thing no one talks about is how George and Ringo kind of grew to hate Paul the most, and I know why. And here's the theory. They were the ones that Paul could do without. He could replace them. He could at the least approximate them. They knew it, kinda. He knew it, certainly. He played drums on some Beatles tracks. Dear Prudence and Back in the USSR are good starters. He played some killer lead guitar too. Fucking Taxman, mate. Fucking owning it. He had, more than once, told George and Ringo how to play their parts. He came up with suggestions, arrangements, and it drove them crazy. And then, when they were all cast as professional Beatles in the docos, you could sometimes see they were seething. Paul struts in like David Brent or Noel Edmonds doing a dance with the camera, says, "Hello, Georgie boy, my love," and tussles his hair to remind him, even in his 50s, he's still and always 2 years younger. George grimaces through the hug, shrugs, says, "I didn't know they made vegetarian leather jackets." In another scene, Ringo is tapping on his knees as Paul and George mug it up on the ukes. Ringo says that he just likes hanging out. He's got his pals. Prior to that, he was not doing coke anymore with the Fat Controller. He's heartfelt. He fucking means it. Paul talks over him, makes a gag, and makes George gag. Now, Lennon was a rough as shit guitarist, but he had something when he'd hit at those strings. The baggage, the grit, a cynicism and such wit. He was a wife beater. He even hid that inside a song. He tried a few mea culpas and far too many margaritas. He was a drunk. He was hurting. He was a child for far too long. But he was punk as fuck. And he was, when it suited, the leader of the band. Paul never forgot that, just as Ringo and George never forgot that Paul, bless him, a genius, the greatest melodicist, a jobbing writer, to put all others to shame. He had told them that they were not only nothing, they were something he could do himself. They smiled for the photos, threw peace signs. Ringo's doing it still, but I reckon there's more than one reason he always wears sunglasses. And George went to his grave, never turning up at a McCartney jam. So there's a few poems like that in the book, a few sort of essays and ideas around music. I'm someone that's always been obsessed with it, with music, I guess. There was also some encounters, some stories around meeting musicians. I want to read one now about a famous musician called Steve Gadd, a drummer who has played on so many famous songs by famous people that even if you've never heard the name Steve Gadd, you've probably heard him play. And I met him last year when he came to New Zealand. I interviewed him on Radio New Zealand. As part of the Jesse Mulligan show, I helped out interviewing him. And then I saw him play. And so this is called Giving the Drummer Some. I met Steve Gadd. He had played on many of the greatest songs ever. And just in case he had forgotten, I reminded him. I got him to sign my records. He was embarrassed and told me he liked the fact I was wearing shorts. It takes all sorts, and I was the only one he'd seen not wearing long pants, so that was our talking point. A local drummer ape had been assigned as his driver. When he wasn't sitting on Steve Gadd's knee, he was picking the lice from his back and swallowing swiftly as if it contained the secret to the feather-touched triplet movement between the hi-hat, the bass drum, the snare. I didn't dare tell Mr. Steve Gadd that I was sure I could play 50 Ways long before I could. But as he looked at me with the eyes that had stared at the back of Paul Simon's head, I could tell that he knew I would not have it right. What's left to say? I told him that late in the evening was some sort of secret pathway. He told me he liked my hat. A day later, I would drive 200 kilometres to give him a hat. Oh, and to watch his gig. I was blown away to see and hear the guy that I had been aware of since I was 7 or 8. His shuffle feel intros, outros and bridging fills for Paul and Carly Simon, for James Taylor and Steely Dan, for Chick Corea and others, all dangled around him like dazzlers in chains. He was blown away to see me in jandals. "You're wearing flip-flops?" he questioned, in the voice that had told Ricky Lee Jones he might have something for that bit during Chucky's in Love. The local drummer turned chauffeur was crouched on the stage later in that evening, almost sitting inside the pocket of the solo to Asia, ready to pounce at the drop of said hat. Music poems. There's lots of music poems, poems about music. This one is a prose poem, and it is about music or mentions music. It's about the movie Batman that came out in 1989, the one with Prince doing the soundtrack. And this is one of 2 poems in the book that directly mentions the Prince song Electric Chair and the Batman soundtrack. I was pretty pleased to get that over the line, to have an editor and publisher let 2 poems about that album and song into the book. So I might read both of them to you, but I'm going to read this one now. It's called All Hail. Sure, I could point to almost any other Prince album before it and a few after it as being better, but the sentimental favourite will always be Prince's soundtrack to Batman. Not the actual score, and basically the soundtrack to the movie of Batman that was playing in Prince's head. Prince the Star, of course. It's actually one of his best albums as Snapshot. It's concise, it's song-based, it showcases pop, funk, ballads. There's just enough indulgence and weirdness to remind you it's Prince and not just somebody trying to be Prince. And more than just about any other record in my collection, this one anchors me to a time and place. I remember going to see the film for a second time in Napier. My parents picked me up afterwards, me and a friend. Not quite teenagers. We made them put the Prince soundtrack tape in the car for the drive back. Bungee jumping had just made it to Hawke's Bay, so we had to take a detour. I remember the car stereo was pumping electric chair, and we made it to the car park of Countdown where for $25 you could bungee jump from a crane over the shingle car park. No scenery, but there was a double airbed mattress ready to save any party men and or party women. We watched one party woman rip her black t-shirt off and go down in her off-white bra. She looked as filthy as her bra. She poked her tongue out and shrieked. She made the sign of the horns with her hands. Her hair, the stuff you hate to have to fish out of a communal plug hole. She is framed for all time in a slow-motion fug of her own cigarette smoke. The car stereo playing the arms of Orion. She was in that instant beautiful, worth thinking about the next time we shuffled the deck of Batman bubblegum cards. The heat rising up off the tarmac and bubbling away at the corners of the photograph in my mind. Hawke's Bay, you rotten egg, you beautiful, mad, bad thing. There are a few poems in this book that mention Hawke's Bay or come from Hawke's Bay, as I come from Hawke's Bay. So Hawke's Bay comes up. Sometimes it's mentioned, sometimes it's just where the poem is set. I'm going to read you the other prose poem in the book that is really about the Travelling Wilburys tape, but it's not really about that at all. It's really about my parents and the famous Philip Larkin poem about your parents fucking you up. So this is called End of the Larkin Line. When the first Travelling Wilburys album was released, we took a drive into Hastings. Friday night, late night shopping. It was me and my brother in the back of the car, our usual spots, and mum and dad up front. They bought the tape. They bought the album on cassette tape. No CDs then, not in our house anyway. And so we drove in, got told on the way that the folks would be buying an important album. And then, when home, we all sat on the floor by the stereo and they played it. Mum and dad told us about how this was one of the Beatles and the guy from ELO, and that Roy Orbison was a rock and roll legend, and Bob Dylan a poet and a prophet. Tom Petty was the young guy, the new kid on the block. But he'd been around the block writing on a tune or two. We sat and listened to the album right through, and then again a second time straight away. We were allowed to stay up late to take it all in, or try at least. Your mum and dad might fuck you up, but the real tragedy is you hardly ever remember to thank them. I've got other poems about my family in here. Many, actually. It was funny looking when the book was finally published and I got to see it for the first time as a book. I realised just how much I had written about my dad, maybe in particular, but my family. And so here's one about my mum. It's called Poems. I never knew if my mum ever read my poems. Last weekend we caught up, briefly. She couldn't remember the name of the book she'd been reading, nor the author, but she definitely had it somewhere on her Kindle. You'd like her, she said. She writes all her stories a bit like you do, in funny long columns. I am really just randomly picking things here, and I don't want to just read music ones because the book is full of music and music ones, and I want to try and find some things that aren't just about that. Here's a very short poem called It Takes Time to Heal, but Time is Not a Healer. No, I am not a healer. I'm too self-centric. Wounds bring words, and I need the material. What else can I find for you before I end up going back to reading a music poem? Oh, I'll read one about my brother, or that mentions my brother. This is called My Brother and Me. My brother lives in Auckland and is loaded and is one of those sort of 1%er types. And I don't know if he's ever read poetry or ever will. But we get on well when we see each other. We find our common ground, and this is a bit about that. And it's a bit about how, everything that you need to know is in this. It's called My Brother and Me. My brother lives in a different city. In fact, we're worlds apart. There are a few years between us and salary brackets too. We have different hobbies. He likes counting his money. I wouldn't last long at that. My brother lives in a different city. In fact, we're worlds apart. But recently, we've found common ground. We're fathers. We have our own families now. And we take them to the zoo. Do things like that. Things people with families might do. So on a recent trip together to the zoo, it was a stroll down memory lane. We hadn't been there in that same place together in over 30 years. The bears were in different places, but the further we walked, the more familiar it seemed. And then we got to the rhino, majestic thing, its head lowered and searching, its horns and hide, reminding us that it is linked to the dinosaurs. We're not, I said, leaving until we see it drop a shit. My brother sniggered, not so much at what I had said, more at the possibility, and then, as if on cue, not a shit, but a huge whooshing sound like an outboard motor. This thing was pissing. An enormous, efficient surge, and we laughed, my brother and me. No longer worlds apart, because some days all you need is a huge rhino pissing. So that's for my brother, and I'm aware that I mentioned that there were two poems that talked about the Prince song Electric Chair and the Batman soundtrack. So I want to read you the other one because it's a wildly different type of poem from the first one. I was thinking about TED Talks, and I wrote a bunch of poems about different TEDs, imagining that these would be TED, because I was thinking about how shit I would be at doing a TED Talk. And so I wrote this one about Ted Danson. I called it the Ted Danson Talk. And then I wrote another one about Ted Turner, called it the Ted Turner Talk, and so on. There was a Ted Nugent one, and I think the Ted Nugent one nearly made it into the book, but I decided I only wanted one of them in the book. I might do some more. I think I've done about 5, but the one that I liked to go in the book because it was different is called the Ted Bundy Talks, and I feel like I need to say that I wrote this before the recent spate of Netflix docos and biopics and things, the whole sort of recent wave of talk about him, because I always found the Ted Bundy story disgusting and fascinating in perhaps equal measures. The Ted Bundy Talks. They asked Ted Bundy, after he was caught, why he was able to strangle and murder so many people, 17 women at that point or something. His answer: there are so many people. My question: who is they? Ted Bundy died in 1989. He is listed on Wikipedia as an American serial killer, kidnapper, rapist, burglar, and necrophile. Just as, say, Lenny Henry gets the wiki treatment and is dubbed a British stand-up comedian, actor, singer, writer, and television presenter. You can click on hyperlinked text to find out more about the roles of serial killer, kidnapper, rapist, burglar, and necrophile. Wikipedia assumes you don't need to know anything else about the roles of actor, singer, writer, television presenter, nor British stand-up comedian. There are no further links. The pro wrestler King Kong Bundy was named after King Kong and Ted Bundy. His aim was to be seen as being as scary as both, a dreaded combination. The pro wrestler King Kong Bundy is still alive. This surprised me. He turned 60 just yesterday, but only if you're reading this today. Ted Bundy was regarded as handsome and charismatic by his victims. I'm not sure how we know this. We can't quite take their word for it. I'm sure he did. Sometimes Ted Bundy kept parts of a victim for months, turning a light on, opening a cupboard, taking some joy from seeing what was there, from knowing it belonged now to him. Other times he would sneak into a room and just bludgeon someone in the dark, smash their skull and leave. Ted Bundy referred to himself as the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet. I never got to meet him, but I believed him. In 1989, Ted Bundy died. He was executed. The electric chair was his final resting place. In 1989, my favourite song was Electric Chair by Prince. Look, I don't know what that's really about. Well, I guess it spells it out. I don't really know why I wrote that beyond the whole TED Talk thing and just being so creeped out by the Ted Bundy story. But if it felt like I was trying hard to justify that I wrote it before the recent docos, the proof is actually in there because King Kong Bundy is now dead. He died shortly after turning 60. So he was alive when I wrote that and then dead after. I'm going to read a poem now about some of the shit I got up to when I was a student, really, and thinking back on that as a father, which I guess is another one of the themes of the book. Me eventually sort of growing up after being a fucking idiot for far too long. This is a poem called The Flat on the Terrace. I walk along the terrace, see the flat I lived in for years and years. I had no cares back then beyond knowing where the next CD was going to come from. My flatmates thought I was mad. And these were people that cheated on their girlfriends, took carving knives with them for late night walks, just in case. One of them tried to kill a mouse by smearing peanut butter on a golf putting return machine. One of them drank cups of tea while shitting. One of them watched pornos while doing his taxes. I wanted to shout, and I'm the bad guy, like Michael Douglas does in that film. Hang on, maybe I hadn't even quite seen that just then. It was madness, though. That's for fucking sure. No one carried a key, and one day, when the window wasn't unlatched for someone to open and step through, he just threw his drink bottle through it, pushing the glass aside and stepped in. No problem. When it was my night to cook, I'd write a cheque for the pizza place and disappear, go elsewhere, anywhere else. Possibly in a bunker, because the cheque would likely bounce. I had a room full of music and cigarette smoke, a head full of possibly undiagnosed anxiety or more likely laziness, and I had about 50 or 60 square grid maths books that I wrote poems in. The others in the flat could not handle that. The time when I found a guy taking a piss into an electric frying pan on my bed seemed reasonable, particularly when he explained that the drinking game in the other room had it that no one was allowed to urinate. Several of the others had pissed themselves in front of each other, probably mid-swig, but this guy had standards and a contingency, and this wasn't even the worst thing that could happen of a night. We rode a shopping trolley down the stairs and into the wall, missing a giant window that could have launched at least one of us into a waiting hospital bed. We drank a 5-litre bottle of whiskey on a pouring frame, and one night someone got laid out for denying a shot. And all of this and so much more comes flooding back to me on Wednesdays after lunch, having finished one job to get to another, and then from there down the road to collect my son from his school. I look across the road at the house, somehow still standing, and I think of Tom Waits and Bukowski, and teaching drum lessons in the lounge while my protesting flatmate tried to watch TV at the same time, his arms folded, his brow knotted. I think of Baxter and Sam Hunt and Loris Edmond and the one-night stand that was referred to as a spear chucker, presumably because of the colour of her skin, and that any of these sins don't come close to the very worst of the behaviour back then. I heard one of the guys is a merchant banker. Well, why not? He was rehearsing for that gig when he was sleepwalking blind drunk to shit on a couch. The other two, I've no idea. Commerce degrees, and they graduated long before me. We're all lucky to be alive, and beyond that, to not know anything much about each other anymore. So yeah, that's a memory one. I'll read you another memory one, actually, that's just called Memory. This is about when I was a teenager and my grandfather died. When my grandma phoned, I knew something was up. Could tell by her voice. She sounded worried, and she never worried. She asked for Dad's number. She'd forgotten it, wanted to call him, needed to call. I gave her the number, and then she said, "Thanks. It's your grandfather, you see. I think he's dead." And that was it at the end of the line. We all drove down. The man from the car yard gave us all a hug, told us to be strong, that we'd all need to be together. And we went to the house. He was on the bed. He was dead. He must have known something was about to be up. He had gone to town, paid all the bills, mowed the lawn, and then had a wee rest. He's having it still. This was as close to showing love as he ever got. All the jobs done. I was 16 in the middle of my school C exams. I'd have something to write about that next day. They told me to stay in the lounge so I didn't see the body, but I wanted to see the body. I snuck a peek. He looked calm, but it also looked like he wasn't there. He'd already left. I'm glad I got to see him that final time. No arguing, no finger pointing, no hands flailing, just a big sleep. My grandma sang some old scout songs as they carried him out of the house that they'd lived in forever. What was left of him went out in a big old zip-up black bag. Yeah, so that's the memory of that. And I'm going to finish with... God, I feel like I've depressed you. And I hadn't meant to do that. I actually think this is quite a funny book with some funny poems in it. But I'm going to finish with a poem called Taxi. It's another kind of memory poem in a way. He's in the back of the car as usual, and I'm his taxi driver. My son asks me if the day he was born was the best day of my life, and I say yes, of course. What about when you and Mum got married? Second, nearly as good. Can't have one without the other. He nods, and I didn't go on to tell him that the third best day of my life was when he had just turned 2. We were driving to Hawke's Bay for Christmas, he and his mother asleep, and I had the iPod connected to the car stereo, and I made a playlist. The theme from the TV show Taxi on a loop, so that I didn't have to keep pressing play or find the repeat function. I had the same track loaded 30 or 40 times. Bob James's perfect Fender Rhodes instrumental, with Ralph McDonald on percussion and Idris Muhammad on drums. Sounds like Eric Gale's guitar, slow burning in the lava lamp glow. I was their taxi driver. I'd look to the left, then to the back left, that music from my childhood guiding the way. It was like I was the yellow cab in a time loop, a New York minute, driving over and over the Queensborough Bridge, checking my buckled passengers. 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock, resting, their beautiful faces, those wondrous souls, all fire, all glitter and gold, first and second, first equal of course, and the music, my mantra, my meditation, taking me back to the Friday nights when we'd wait for Dad to come home with the fish and chips, when we'd laugh at Louie's anger and Jim's madness and the weird and silly and wonderful Latka. Me and my brother and my mum and dad were maybe at our closest watching MASH and Family Ties, Blackadder, The Young Ones, Cheers, Married with Children and a few others. Definitely Taxi. But here I was driving the white lines with this music that was taking me back and taking me back as I was edging ever forward in the yellow cab of my imagination. Whimsy, nostalgia, and so much more than that. But does there need to be more than that? Those two things are so beautiful, so joyous and sad all at once. They've helped me along in so many ways, through so many ways. Profound beauty all wrapped up in that slick and lovely groove. People would maybe call a song like that soulless. To me it's the very embodiment of soul, and so it rolled on, and I did too. Checking their faces, me, elated, the calmest I'd been in an age, or more. And I was never Bobby Wheeler. I was their Alex Rieger. But I was better than Alex Rieger, because they didn't just have me, I had them, and we had the music. Even if it was only me listening. That was the third best day of my life. And if I whispered that it was the best, well, that was only because they were asleep, and I was their taxi. Yeah, that's my book. That's some of the stuff in my book. I'm going to quickly actually read you a real short one, because I feel like I like that poem Taxi a lot, but I feel like we got into a bit of a slow, almost depressing groove there. So I'm going to read you two very short poems, two of the shortest poems in the book that are about criticism, since that's what I've done, music criticism, for a lot of my life. This one's dedicated to all of you, really. It's called Everyone, so it's for everyone. I said the orchestra was bad, and a guy wrote in and called me a cunt and told me to wash. We're all critics at the end of the day. And this one, the lovely folk at Phantom Bill Stickers are going to stick this one up on one of those big giant poetry posters. I love Phantom Bill Stickers, and they love people that are into the arts and culture, and they are great people. This is called Real Talk, and it has been really great talking to you in this virtual way, and I'm amazed if you made it through this and kept listening, and I'm blown away if you liked any of this at all, or just listened to it and thought something. This is called Real Talk. No one ever built a statue in honour of a critic, but only because they knew it could never be good enough. Thanks a lot.